I'm Roberta Glass, and you're listening to my True Crime Report. My guest, John Collins, is a forensic science and criminal justice expert who has served as a practicing scientist or administrator in federal, state, and local forensic science laboratories. He has also written extensively about what he calls the wrongful conviction of forensic science and how the Innocence movement denigrates science to further its cause. Welcome, John Collins.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. Back in 1992, I graduated from Michigan State University with a forensic science degree. And back then, Michigan State had really the premier collegiate forensic program. This was before CSI, so we didn't have all of the college programs that we have today. It seems like almost every college now has a forensic science program, but back then, Michigan State really had the only major forensic program. And my first job was with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I trained as what's called a firearm and tool mark examiner. And what a firearm and tool mark examiner does is really look at marks, scratch marks, cut marks, marks on the surface of a bullet from the barrel of the gun that fired it, those types of things. So what I spent most of my time doing down in Atlanta was determining if specific guns fired a specific bullet that may have been recovered from a body at autopsy or from a shooting victim in surgery. And I was recruited by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Laboratory, which was also in Atlanta. And at that time, coincidentally, we were hosting the Olympic Games. And I became, unexpectedly part of the forensic team that investigated the bombing of the 1996 Olympics and then the serial bombings that happened in the city of Atlanta. What my job was to analyze the nails that the bomber was packing in these bombs, because all of those nails have manufacturing marks. And so that was the biggest case in my career, always will be. I got into forensic laboratory management at about the age of 30 up in the Chicago area, and I went on to become the director of forensic science for the state of Michigan, where I oversaw 7 laboratories and about 250 to 300 people, depending on the time period. So basically was in a forensic laboratory environment for about 20 years before I retired my career and started my current practice as an executive coach and leadership consultant. So I had a great forensic career. I've written 2 books. And I'm very thankful for what I was able to accomplish.
How did you get interested in the subject of innocence fraud?
Well, I was serving on a board of directors for an organization called the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, which is a group of forensic laboratory administrators serving about 400 forensic laboratories around the country. And we were trying to, as a board and as an organization, we were trying to get more federal support for the practice of forensic science, which really struggles for resources. And what we discovered was that an organization based in Manhattan called the Innocence Project, which is a very well-known organization, was really causing us some problems in Washington, D.C., because they were characterizing forensic science professionals as being fraudulent, incompetent. And so, as you might imagine, it was really interfering with the work that we were trying to do to get support. And so myself and my colleague, Jay Jarvis, who was also on the board of directors at the time, we were asking ourselves, who are these Innocence Project people and what are they doing? And that was really the start of it. And from there, I spent about, the better part of 11 years writing a lot of articles, doing public speaking engagements on the Innocence Project and this field, what's called post-conviction litigation, which is the legal processes that happen or that can happen for certain individuals who are convicted of crimes, but they happen after they've already been convicted and are serving time in prison. So essentially what post-conviction litigation is an attempt by attorneys and legal activists to try to prove the innocence of somebody that is in prison. And it's a fascinating field.
Yeah, and you said that DNA evidence really came into popularity in the 90s. You wrote about some interesting trials where it came, the William Kennedy Smith trial, Marv Albert that I'd forgotten about. And also the O.J. Simpson trial, and you said that was really the beginning of the birth kind of the innocence movement, and they're using and putting forensic science in their bullseye. How so?
Well, you have to kind of look back at that time period, which has really fascinated me because you have this confluence of events. And what really kicked it off, in my view, and I wrote about this in my book, Crime Lab Report, is the execution of Ted Bundy in 1989. Because with the execution of Ted Bundy, who was a horrific serial killer, the public support for capital punishment at the time was nearing an all-time high. There was a lot of high-profile serial types of killings that had taken place, and Ted Bundy was really the poster boy for what we would call the psychopathic, deranged serial killer. And so anybody that was committed to ending capital punishment or abolishing the death penalty in the United States was really demoralized because of the popularity of capital punishment, thanks in part to individuals like Ted Bundy. Well, what happened a short time later was the exoneration of a guy named Gary Dotson in the Chicago area who had been convicted and spent time in prison for sexual assault. And DNA actually proved his innocence. And so it was really the birth of the Innocence movement. But at that time, in the late 80s, very early 90s, a lot of people didn't know about DNA. But with the cases that you cited, the O.J. Simpson trial, the rape or the sexual assault trial of Marv Albert, the sportscaster, William Kennedy Smith, the nephew of the late Senator Ted Kennedy, all of a sudden the public came to understand this thing that we call forensic DNA. So on one hand, you have the use of forensic DNA for the purpose of proving guilt, assuming that guilt is justified, but you now also had a situation where you could potentially use this powerful DNA evidence to prove innocence. And it really all started, I think, with those cases, but most notably the O.J. Simpson trial.
Right. You also talk about the hair testing that came into question, right? The Manhattan Innocence Project was saying that it's so unreliable. What is hair comparison testing?
So that's a good question. So hair comparison is a very common and one of the oldest of the forensic tests that are conducted in forensic science laboratories. And so basically what a forensic scientist is doing, one who is specially trained in this type of analysis, is they are looking at the physical and optical properties of hair. So, for example, let's say that a woman is kidnapped and murdered, and the suspect throws her body in the trunk of the car and then disposes of her body, let's say, in a state park somewhere. Let's say police find the suspect, they seize the car, and they find what appears to be hair in the trunk of the car that looks similar to the hair of the victim. Well, forensic scientists can look at those hairs, compare them to the hairs from the body, and determine if there are similarities or not, or if they can completely eliminate the hair as having came from that particular victim. So hairs can be used for a lot of different reasons, but when forensic scientists say or conclude that, let's say, a crime scene hair could have come from a particular source, a particular defendant, that's somewhat controversial because in today's day and age, we like to think of forensic science as providing conclusive proof that I can identify this bullet as being fired from this gun, or I can identify this fingerprint as coming from this suspect, or I can identify this blood stain as having the DNA of the perpetrator. But when you start saying things like could have, that causes some controversy. But the reality is that that is the limitation of hair comparison. Back in the day, before we had DNA, that's what forensic scientists did. They could look at these hairs and say if there were similarities or significant differences. So that limitation in the science made hair comparison an easy target for the Innocence Project. And they went after hair comparison with full force not too long ago. And as you said, I wrote about it in the book.
Yeah, I just want to get to how they did that in a second. But you talk about forensic science is wanting to overstate its meaning, like as an expert on the stand, you feel like you have to please your employer and make the evidence more significant than it actually is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, you hope that that's not the case. You hope that as a forensic scientist that you're going to be able to conduct a scientific analysis of evidence, do your comparisons, and render a conclusion that is objective and untainted by any kinds of bias or incompetence or malicious intent. So, that should be the goal. One of the great challenges in forensic science can sometimes be understanding what is the meaning of a particular conclusion. So, for example, if I was to identify as a forensic scientist, let's say that police take a swab of a doorknob going into a house that is the scene of a violent crime. And let's say they swab the doorknob and we get the DNA profile of the prime suspect in the case. So overstating the meaning of that DNA can be tempting because what that DNA testing does, or those DNA results do, is it allows us to say that a certain individual's DNA is on that doorknob. It does not allow me to say that that individual actually turned that doorknob and entered the crime scene. So we have to be very, very careful when we look at forensic results. Number one, that they be accurate, that we're practicing reliable methods and that the conclusions that we're coming up with are trustworthy. But once we generate those conclusions, it's critical that the meaning that we ascribe to those results is reasonable. And that can sometimes be where it gets dicey if we're not careful.
Yeah, and I find these true crime cases is arguing the other side or the prosecution side or whatever of these cases is that sometimes these innocence organizations are looking for DNA and they're ascribing it meaning it might not have. Do you know what I mean? Like for instance, like the Central Park 5 case, they found DNA of Mateus Reyes and then negated all other evidence.
Right.
So that meant he did it alone, even though, the doctor said that multiple people were involved, multiple confessions, everything sort of erased all for this one bit of evidence. And then everything else, all the other evidence doesn't matter.
Right. And I'm not familiar with that particular case, just on a superficial level I am. But the point that you bring up is a good one because it applies to a lot of different cases that have gone through the post-litigation process. And one of the complaints that I have had, and I have spoken publicly about it, I've written about it, is that there is very little, if any, oversight of these post-conviction litigators and activists. They begin the process by trying to foment, if you will, public outrage over somebody's alleged innocence, somebody who is in prison. Now, let's be clear about something, and that is that the effort to demonstrate the innocence of an individual who has a legitimate claim of innocence and is languishing in prison is an honorable endeavor. I mean, we have to be very, very clear about that. We cannot tolerate any situation where an innocent person is languishing in prison. It's un-American. It runs against everything that we believe should be parcel to an effective criminal justice system. Okay? However, there is an inherent bias and a very strong motivating force within the Innocence Network, and that goes beyond the individual case. They have an enormous political network. The Innocence Movement is a political campaign. It's a social network, and they are trying very, very hard to maintain their relevance and to maintain their funding sources. And so every successful exoneration is not only good for that particular defendant who has been convicted and is sitting in prison, but it's also very good for the political momentum of the Innocence Network. So there is a tremendous bias, and it's almost impossible to overstate, that can kind of weave its way into the objectivity of these post-conviction litigators and activists to the point that they are very much at risk of producing exonerations of individuals that are factually guilty.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you also write that really their goal is to reform the criminal justice system. And to do that, they have to reduce confidence in the American people in the justice system. And you talk about the death penalty, kind of going back to what you were talking about with Ted Bundy, and that really the holy grail for these death penalty activists is an innocent person who gets executed.
Right. And I certainly don't want to suggest that anybody in the Innocence Network or anybody with the Innocence Project would want there to be the execution or the death of an innocent person. I certainly don't believe that to be the case. But to the extent that has happened, and we just don't know if it has or not, the Innocence Project and the activists within the Innocence Network, that is the holy grail, is to find that individual. Because if we can prove that an innocent person was convicted and sentenced to death, and then that sentence was executed, that becomes the death of the death penalty, as far as I'm concerned. And so that's, I think, that one of the underlying themes for the Innocence movement is the abolition of the death penalty. And what better way to do that than to prove that an innocent person died as a result of capital punishment?
Yeah, I noticed just that there seems to be more intensity around death penalty cases, and also, I guess, wilder claims, kind of like you're asked to suspend your disbelief even sort of more, that this kind of lightning. Are you following the Rodney Reed case at all? I don't know.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not.
This DNA was found all over the victim, but now, of course, he was dating the victim. Just kind of like you're asked to believe kind of unbelievable things, things that don't really happen on planet Earth. Happen to this one guy. You know what I mean?
I do, but I think, one of the things that drives that, Roberta, is that we have so much dramatization in today's culture. It's so easy to dramatize things. I mean, even soap commercials are dramatic now. When you watch TV, it's so easy to dramatize things because of the access that people have to video and production capabilities. You can make a video about anything. You can dramatize anything. And drama sells. Drama gets front page headlines. Drama sells newspapers. Drama keeps people coming to watch the nightly news. So the more drama you can produce, the more likely you are to get showcased in the mass media. And so it's that drama that really impairs our ability to look at these cases objectively. So to the extent to which you're looking at these cases and suggesting, I think accurately so, that everything seems to be so wrapped up in pomp and circumstance, and it's because everything is dramatized, and the way that people speak in news interviews is very dramatized. And I, for one, am a big believer that we need to get the drama out of the criminal justice system and have it be more scientific and more objective, because I think that drama is one of our greatest enemies in all of this.
That's interesting. Do you think there's something inherently American that we love this story of the wrongfully convicted?
Oh, yeah. You know what? I call it the Shawshank phenomenon. I appreciate you asking that question. There definitely is. There is something inherently compelling about freedom. The wrongfully imprisoned, those that are in captivity for unjustified reasons suddenly being set free. It's a feel-good story. And so it makes sense that the Innocence Project or the activists in the Innocence Network have been so successful at what they do, because they can leverage this Shawshank phenomenon. And so if they can get into the press and they can convince a willing reporter or get a willing reporter on their side and have this reporter start to tell the story of this individual's supposed innocence, you have the beginnings for the post-conviction litigation process that could eventually lead to a full-fledged judicial exoneration. But it all begins many times with that public drama portrayal that gets the ball rolling.
I'm just going to circle back a little bit back to the FBI study with the hair. The Manhattan Innocence Project and the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys agreed to have the FBI review 2,000 hair comparison cases between 85 and 2000. What were the results of that study?
And first of all, I want to make a clarifying point here. The FBI was forced into it. The FBI did not want to do it. I have some knowledge about this and how it took place. But the FBI, or I should say that the Innocence Network and the criminal defense community of criminal defense lawyers, they had some leverage in the White House at the time. And the Justice Department essentially, as I understand it, forced the FBI to do this study, knowing full well that the risks of misunderstandings occurring or a risk of the results being blown out of proportion were extremely high. But as I understand it, the FBI really had very little choice but to try to do this study and hope for the best. So what they found was that, and you have to forgive me, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but what they found is that in these past hair comparison cases, that there were instances when FBI forensic scientists misstated the results of their analyses, or perhaps that their results, the way that they worded the results, was unjustified, or maybe they overstated the results, that they used the term match, which we really don't use anymore. But back in the day, it was common for forensic hair comparison scientists to say that hairs matched when in fact they were just similar. But that was the state of the science at the time. And so the Innocence Network, activists in the Innocence Network, took these results and basically used them to not only impugn the science of hair comparison, but to impugn the entire forensic science community, which was what we all feared when the study was first announced.
Interesting. There's also another study, the Gould study. What was that about?
Yeah, I wish more people knew about the Gould study because it was interesting. So John Gould is a professor at American University, and he and his colleagues did a fascinating study where they looked at what they called close calls. When I say close call, it's a close call in potentially convicting an innocent person. And what they did was they identified 10 contributing factors to erroneous convictions. And what Gould found in the study was that what really drove these erroneous convictions more than anything else was having a defendant who was known by the police. And for whatever reason, the police kind of latched onto this individual, and it began a cascading series of events that eventually lead to potentially an erroneous conviction. At the bottom of that 10 list was forensic science, which completely conflicted with what the Innocence Project in Manhattan and innocence activists all across the country had been saying were the leading causes of erroneous convictions. So, not shockingly, I made a very valiant effort to try to find where the Innocence Project showcased John Gould's study at the Innocence Project website, which claims to be kind of a clearinghouse for all things Innocence Network and exoneration, and it was nowhere to be found. I tried, I couldn't find it. And I think it's because Gould's study refuted the rhetoric of the Innocence campaign for so many years. And so anybody that's interested in post-conviction litigation or the exoneration of innocent people or what are the causes of erroneous convictions, I would really have them. You can go to YouTube and you can find John Gould's debriefing to the National Institute of Justice. And it was really interesting. They did a nice job, and it was a great service to the criminal justice system. It's just a shame that the innocence activists just kind of chose to dismiss it.
Also, the innocence movement also relies on very sympathetic or activist journalists. Why do you think that there's so few journalists who are willing to write skeptical articles about these cases?
Well, it's a great question, and I want to be careful how I answer it because I don't want to add partisan politics into the conversation where it's not necessary. So the reality is that these individuals that, I'll put it to you this way. When we think of being hard on crime, tough on crime, that tends to be a theme that we see in more Republican types of administrations. When we talk about individuals that are interested in championing human rights and the rights of defendants and due process, we tend to see that in Democratic administrations. So, we have these different competing political philosophies that affect the way that we see these things. Okay. Gosh, Roberta, can you remind me what your question was? I got ahead of myself.
It's okay. I just asked why journalists were so reluctant to write skeptical articles.
Right. So thank you. I apologize, but thank you for the reminder. So anyway, I had a colleague of mine when I was working out in Chicago who was a former reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And I asked him specifically because I told him some of the things that I was encountering in dealing with the Innocence Network. He says, when I first got into journalism, if you asked a journalism student or a young journalist, why they want to be a journalist, they would tell you, I want to tell the story. I want to tell the story. I want to find out what's going on. I want to get the facts, and I want to report the facts to the public. And this was about 10 years, a little over 10 years that I had this conversation with him. And he said, but if you ask a journalism student today or a young journalism, why is it they want to go into journalism? Their answer is that because I want to change the world.
Wow.
Well, that's not journalism, that's activism. So what we have, which comes to the detriment of our entire republic, and quite honestly, I would say our freedoms, is we have journalists today who do not see it as their role and are not interested in their role of gathering facts and telling the story as it actually happened. They have a political agenda. And so the Innocence Network, the stories of the Innocence Network and the stories of these exonerations are very, very strong themes that resonate with individuals that have certain political ideologies or certain political agendas. And it's really a shame. And I think that that's why it's happening. It's simply to drive a particular political agenda, which is the reform of the American criminal justice system and showcasing the exonerations as the justification for doing it.
In what way do you think they want to reform it?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, and I'm not even going to make a statement here as to whether or not I even agree with it or not, because I think reasonable people can look at the criminal justice system as it is today and say that we have some pretty serious problems. But where I think we're going with this, and I'm prognosticating a little bit here and looking out 10, 20, 30 years into the future, is I think that there's a movement afoot to redefine what it means to commit a crime, that perhaps in the future a crime is not going to be thought of as evil perpetrated against society or an individual, but instead it is evidence of a medical disorder, that people commit crimes because they're sick or they are socioeconomically disadvantaged. But it's a complete shift in thinking. And I think that that's where many individuals in the Innocence Network and in other circles, that's how they view the criminal justice system. So if you think of crime then as being caused by an individual that is sick, it becomes a healthcare issue, not a criminal issue. And we treat people who are sick not by throwing them behind bars, but by getting them treatment. And, there may be some justification to that.
Well, certainly that would make maybe a little bit more sense with the war on drugs or drug laws, looking at it like that. But when you're talking about violent crimes, then you're making the perpetrator a victim. And it's quite shocking, right?
Well, you are making the perpetrator a victim, and that is a difficult thing for the victims of crime and their families who want justice to digest. Probably one of the most offensive things that a surviving victim of a crime or the family members of a surviving or deceased victim of a crime can experience is listening to the perpetrator being portrayed as a victim. And so it puts us in a very difficult position where we can have some very serious conflict occur between the community of crime victims, who they have their own campaigns and organizations, being pit against these justice reform activists. And that battle is not even close to coming to a head yet. And I don't know how far down the road that is, but I think it's coming, and it's going to be an ugly one.
That's interesting. Because, I was raised in a very left-wing family, and my family isn't too happy about the things that I talk about. But I had an, experience where I almost died. I'd had a long recovery. And so to me, these issues connect to a victim's right to really live, right? Wouldn't that be, you talk about like life, freedom issues or human rights issues? I don't understand why the left wouldn't embrace victim rights. It's so strange to me. Do you think that we're uncomfortable with punishing people in this society?
I think we're becoming increasingly difficult punishing people because, this gets into some, I won't go too far down that road, but, we are learning more and more about the human brain. Because of disorders like, cerebral palsy, autism, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, we are learning more and more about the human brain. And we are also learning that there are some common trends amongst individuals who are convicted and imprisoned for crimes. So there is a remarkable number of people in prison, for example, who have learning disabilities, communication disorders, emotional, behavioral disturbances from which they're suffering. And, we can't ignore that. We can't ignore that and pretend that that's not happening. If we're smarter about how we do things, we should be spending a lot more of our resources trying to figure out how to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place, because I think that that's where you can get bipartisan, cross-ideological collaboration trying to prevent these crimes. Not that you're not going to have any disagreements, but crime prevention, I think, needs to be the number one priority of society, at least in a criminal justice context, but at the same time recognizing that there are some perpetrators that are just absolutely horrific. And I've been involved with cases with defendants that I'm certain were complete psychopaths, and you can't treat them, at least not with our current abilities.
Speaking of dangerous psychopaths, you were one of the early people to talk about the Steven Avery case in context of the Innocence movement. Do you think Making a Murderer was made as a way to rewrite sort of an embarrassing history for the Innocence movement?
I think so. It's hard to say. I have really strange, melancholy feelings about the Steven Avery case, because that case has been dramatized. I mean, it's off the charts how much that's been dramatized and the fiction that has been injected into that story. Not that I'm dismissing the legitimacy of your question, because I'm not, but it's an example of a case that is has gone so far beyond reason and has become a pop culture, almost a cult-like phenomenon that you can't even include the Steven Avery case in the discussion anymore, I think, about criminal justice reform, because it has been completely fictionalized. And that's the only case that I can think of, at least right now, that has crossed that threshold, that it has entered a realm of its own, and it's really no longer useful to us in having an intelligent conversation about post-conviction litigation and crime prevention and the use of forensic science. So I have to tell you, I don't even know where to go with the Steven Avery case anymore, because as you said, I've written a lot about it, and I'll let that stand on its own, but that case is it's off the charts.
One of the really interesting cases you looked at was the Gregory Taylor case.
Yeah.
And that had wide implications for the whole North Carolina crime laboratory. And can you talk about how the Gregory Taylor case was presented to the public and what you found out about it?
Yeah, so just very quickly for your listeners, the Gregory Taylor case was a case, I prefer to call it the Jacquetta Thomas case.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jacquetta Thomas was a local, a woman who was brutally murdered. Her body was left in a cul-de-sac outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And Gregory Taylor's, and so to give you kind of a feel for it, because I've seen crime scene photos and kind of aerial shots of the area. But you know how, like, on the side of highways, you have these billboards, these like large commercial billboards that have to be serviced. And so there was a very rough, unpaved access drive that came to a cul-de-sac, which was presumably there so that people could service this billboard. And so at the side of this cul-de-sac lay the body of Jacquetta Thomas, who had been, I believe, bludgeoned to death, stabbed. A bunch of things happened. And just a few yards away, I don't remember the exact distance, was the vehicle owned by Gregory Taylor, stuck in mud. So he became a prime suspect. And so there was a tremendous, investigation took place, and I won't go into all the details, but he was eventually convicted and sentenced, did time in prison for this murder. The evidence of his guilt in this case is overwhelming. And the fact that his car was there in the mud was believed by investigators to be because they were trying to find a route of egress away from this murder scene without being seen going back down the cul-de-sac back to the main road. So they tried to essentially four-wheel their way out. Gregory Taylor said, no, we were just there, and I think I saw the body, but I thought it was a roll of carpeting. And he was just saying all these different things, conflicting stories. Well, he eventually was exonerated, and there was a post-conviction, what they call post-conviction relief, where millions and millions of dollars were awarded to Gregory Taylor for this supposed erroneous conviction. It really is a case that takes the cake in terms of looking at the methods of the Innocence litigators and the process of post-conviction litigation. And you look at this case and you say, my God, something is wrong. This shouldn't have happened this way. And that's why I wrote about it.
And I'm so glad you did, because even before I really started covering true crime, I remember watching interviews with Gregory Taylor when he had just gotten out of prison. And he just rang my alarm bells like no other person, for just seeming hugely guilty. And I was looking for a long time for critical writing. This is before I knew to go to the court cases. Critical writing, I would put in like Gregory Taylor, guilty. Nothing would come up. Everything was about, his innocence. And so I guess my question is, once they get this kind of legal mandate, is it hard for writers to write? Can you legally write is someone is guilty when they've been given this kind of legal mandate of innocence?
Oh, it's tough.
Tricky?
It's very tricky. I even worry about when I was doing a lot of my writing in the publication. So my book is called Crime Lab Report. Crime Lab Report was the name of the publication that my colleague Jay Jarvis and I put out over about an 11-year period beginning in 2007. And so Crime Lab Report is an anthology of those writings, but it also walks through these cases and tells the story of what was going on in the American criminal justice system at the time of our writings. But I even worried, and even at the start of my book, there's a disclaimer that, says that, look, I don't have any official opinion about guilt or innocence of anybody that I'm discussing in this book. And that I encourage anybody, including listeners of this podcast, is that if you want to come to a conclusion about somebody's guilt or innocence, you have to do your own homework. Because the challenge that we have in the criminal justice system is after there's a conviction, or I should say after there's a verdict, we don't get this envelope that floats out of the sky and we open it up and say, oh, yay, we got it right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Or, oh, my goodness, we got it wrong. It doesn't work that way. We don't have access to what many people in the research community call ground truth. The only thing that we can do is look at evidence and then come to the best conclusion that we can based upon the evidence that we have. And in my opinion, when you look at the Gregory Taylor case, the evidence of guilt far outweighs any evidence of innocence that would have justified an exoneration. But that's my opinion. It's not a statement of fact. And I have to be honest, I don't know who killed Jacquetta Thomas. All I know is what the evidence pointed to.
Okay. I guess I had a reaction to your work from doing this podcast and getting, a lot of criticism from people who say, you don't understand. There's so many people. Our criminal justice system is a joke. Innocent people are, convicted all the time, and you just don't understand, and argue with them about cases. And I guess my reaction was that it's not just that forensic science is in the bullseye. It's really any piece of evidence, depending on the case, that is really damning. So, in the West Memphis 3 case, there was no DNA, and that's what supporters will say. Well, there's no DNA. And if it's an eyewitness, if an eyewitness is really important, eyewitnesses are not reliable. If it's a confession or multiple confessions, well, haven't you heard of a false confession?
Right.
Do you think that forensic science is more denigrated than other pieces of evidence, and why?
It's hard to draw a comparison. I think that forensic science bears a significant brunt of the attack because there's so much interest in forensic science. I mean, it's celebrated in movies and television shows. And so if you're, like we talked about earlier, if you're a reform activist, confidence in the status quo is really a bad ingredient for reform. You want to lower confidence in the status quo if you're going to have your agenda carry out successfully, right? So it's difficult. If you take, for example, the Gregory Taylor case, that case came about and the potential for exoneration came about because of the media storm that erupted. And so you have this mixing of reality and fiction, and you get these individuals that can neatly piece them together into what appears to be a case of innocence. But going back to your original question, the problem is that our criminal justice system does have a lot of serious problems. And I think that the individuals within the Innocence Network, the value that they are giving us is that they're identifying problems. Even worse than forensic science, we have identified now the challenges with eyewitness testimony. We know that innocent people will sometimes confess to crimes that they never committed. It happened to me in a case that I was working out in Chicago. It was a DNA CODIS hit, or a DNA database hit, that allowed us to prove that the guy that police arrested for a criminal sexual assault, who confessed to that crime, was actually not guilty. And so, yeah, there are some really serious challenges in the criminal justice system. And I'm thankful for innocence activists and for the Innocence Project for the work that they've done to highlight some of these things. But I think reasonable people would agree that under no circumstance is it justified or acceptable to be fraudulent or careless in how you produce these exonerations simply because you're trying to drive your agenda. And that's where we have to put our foot down and say, look, enough is enough. We can't have this.
I guess I have one last question about the Gregory Taylor case. So I guess the weak link was Dwayne Deaver, who was the forensic expert. Was he just a blood expert, or was he more than I'm not sure, in North Carolina? And so all his cases came into question. So
so Dwayne Deaver, I've never met Dwayne Deaver. His role in the case was he was an investigator who had some knowledge of blood results. Dwayne Deaver became the target. In order to produce the drama, they needed to put a face on what they described as being the malicious, needed to hold somebody responsible. They needed a fall guy. And so Dwayne Deaver became that fall guy. And in my analysis of the case, I couldn't really see, and there was a number of individuals that looked at this case. We were provided extensive documentation from unnamed sources that were intimately involved in that case. And so we had a lot of help looking at this case. We spent months and months looking at it. And it was really difficult to see where Dwayne Deaver did anything malicious or egregious that directly caused Gregory Taylor's his conviction. But in the dramatization that was needed, like I said, he became an easier fall guy. And so that's what happened.
Okay. So you said in 2015, you made a prediction that some people's love affair with the Innocence movement would be coming to an end. Do you think that that's come true?
I don't think it's come true yet, but I do know for a fact that we've finally gotten to a place where the press they are not granting the Innocence Project with just the carte blanche. In other words, anything that the Innocence Project says is true. The Innocence Project doesn't have that luxury anymore because I think that their rhetorical excesses have been exposed. And so it's not quite as reflexive. The reporting is not quite as reflexive as it used to be. But that's not to say that there's not journalists out there that still love a good exoneration story. But I think that the momentum has slowed down. And I don't think we're at that point yet. But I think we're going to get to the point where there's going to be some judicial scrutiny of post-conviction litigators and the development of standards on how they should or should not behave, because I think that's long overdue.
Okay, so thank you. Stuff is so fascinating. I hope you'll come back and talk about this some more. Thank you so much, John Collins.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.